Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first official panel at the Illusion HorrorCon 2023. And with me, I have a wide assortment of fantastic guests who want to talk a bit about the role of how to structure your horror RPG. But before we get into it, I want to ask everyone to give a brief introduction of who they are and what they do, so that every one of you can maybe follow them later on and ask them more detailed question about what they just talked about. Why don't we start with Graeme?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Graeme Patrick. I'm known for running RPG Nook YouTube channel and being a writer on Ain't Slayed Nobody podcast for the main arc. I've also recently been doing audio dramas for Rusty Quill for Magnus Protocol, their second season, and Creepy Podcast as well on Bloody Disgusting FM.
Fantastic. Next, we have Heinrich Moore.
Greetings all, Heinrich Moore here. I am a community content creator on Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu Miskatonic repository on DriveThru RPG. I have a number of scenarios there. I'm probably best known for Heinrich's Call of Cthulhu Guide to Character Creation, which, if you've seen the cover, then you probably know all about it. Recently launched Heinrich's Call of Cthulhu Guide to Carcosa. We've got a Twitch stream of that live as well on Symphony Entertainment if you want to check it out. And I am a community organizer, one of the organizers for the annual Miskatonic Repository Convention.
Fantastic. Next, we just go in the circle. Travis Legge.
Hey everybody, I'm Travis Legge. Pronouns are he, they. When I'm not showing up and talking on panels, I'm generally writing games. I have done writing and development for a couple World of Darkness properties, Mage of the Ascension mostly, a little bit of Werewolf, the Apocalypse. I've done a lot of work with Onyx Path on various projects there. Also, I own a company called Aegis Studios. Mostly these days we're mostly doing Savage Worlds settings, but have also done some OGL stuff in the past, some of which veered into horror. And then many years back, I did some independent horror filmmaking, so I have a little bit of experience from that end as well.
Interesting. J.R. Fryer.
Hi, I'm J.R. Fryer, Jason Fryer, writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon. I've been working on Cult since the early 90s on and off. Probably more recently known for writing the Game Master's Guide, Beyond Darkness and Madness. I also do actual plays for Cult, specifically Negative Space, and upcoming With Blood Dipped Wings. So I'm glad to be here.
Great. And
That's a good name.
lastly, we have John Hook.
Hi, I'm John Hook. I am a writer, podcaster. I primarily write Call of Cthulhu adventures. On the repository, I'm doing some stuff. I've also done some stuff for Chaosium and a couple other publishers. And I was a founding member of the Miskatonic University podcast, and I'm currently one of the co-hosts of Modern Mythos with Seth Skorkowski. So that's always a lot of fun. And you can always find me on Discord or Facebook. So that's about it.
Fantastic. And just again for the audience, if you have any questions for any of the members of the panel, feel free to ask them on the YouTube chat, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can, and hope that we can answer as much as we can talk about in this hour and a half or so. To start this off, I thought it would be good and interesting as well if you can share maybe a very memorable scenario hook, because for me a good scenario hook or a good scenario setting always keeps me like it shows me that the scenario writing itself was good, the scenario structured may be good, but if a hook is memorable, then that's at least a good beginning.
I mean, there's a Call of Cthulhu scenario out there that is absolutely awful. It's terrible to play. It's hard to run. and has a terrible ending, but it has the most memorable opening and gets you excited for it, and then you go off the cliff. And that is The Pale God. It opens up where it's in a rainstorm, and a distraught man is coming out of a gazebo, clearly in pain, and as he's calling out to you, he tears his shirt open and his chest rips open, and all these little ihort babies come spilling out of his chest cavity. And there's an amazing illustration that goes with it. I believe the artist is Paul Sullivan, and it's fantastic, right? It's an amazing hook, and it gets you into it. Unfortunately, the rest of the scenario is not that great, or supported very well. It definitely needs a rewrite, but you have to keep that opening because it is just an amazing hook. It gets you into it for sure.
Oh my god.
Somebody else?
Sorry, just going back.
Yeah, trying to think of a scenario now.
One of my favorite kind of all-purpose hooks, because I'm sitting here thinking about like, well, a lot of times in modern, I like to refer to like the language of cinema. So like, you go to a cabin in the woods, you are at summer camp, like these kinds of things that are very like baked into the language of our understanding of horror. But just in terms of like a raw like get somebody's attention, I find gratuitous violence is a very lovely way to sort of hook the folks. Like start things off with something just unconscionably horrible, and then give them a few minutes to like freak out and run away. Give them beats to calm that back down, and then ramp back up to more gratuitous violence.
I'm probably at the other end of the spectrum rather than starting with a set piece, which is always really nice. But for me, a good hook drives the story forward, where you can have a really nice opening with a spectacular set piece like the guy erupting with the Ehort. You need something that will invest the players into the scenario and keep them moving forward. From that scene, they could just walk away, still not really being attached to the actual story itself. So for me, a good hook plants a player on a path, and it invites you to get in the car and stay in the car for the whole journey. So you want to move forward with that and something personal or like binding to the actual players themselves. That's for dark secrets and like pre-gens can really work in your favor if you want to go down that route, or you plan your players out and have that session zero and really like bind them to the story itself. So me, where you want to start with something that really like starts them off with a promise, like the ihort bursting out. That's like a promise to say this story is going to be about these things, and you're going to love it. And films do this all the time. Like you always have this cutaway at the start of films. That's called the promise, and that's what we're trying to tie the audience into the story to keep. There's going to be a sort of a build up now, but we remember that this is coming later on in the story. When it comes to scenarios, you've got to really get the players to invest in the character and the character to invest in the story. It's almost like a daisy chain effect. So a good one for me, thinking back, is probably something like not a job or something like that. It has to be something personal. I'd probably say Unland by Scott Dorr was a good one. Because basically they're there for their own personal reasons. It's something invested in the actual characters. They're driven to go to this place for a secret that they need to forgive themselves about. So it's a very personal journey for the actual players and the character sort of thing, because they've got to confess to themselves and almost like take on that burden of redemption. So it's like they have to have that sort of like sort of invested sort of symbiotic relationship, because they're not just a visual, they're not just a passive audience, they're active within the game.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're hearing from different panelists is what else does the hook do, right? At the baseline, we know that the hook has to draw the characters in and get the story started. But what else does it do? It can, create an impression through the selective use of ultraviolence. It can be an attention getter. It can move the story forward. Ideally, it'll do all of these things, right? But I think it's useful to think of why we like these hooks and what makes them memorable. And it's usually the fact that it's not just a hook, it's the hook plus something else. And one scenario, one campaign setting that I think really delivers well on this promise that Graeme was talking about is the Armitage inquiries, which starts you off with meeting Professor Armitage, I believe, and kind of getting these letters from the future that are really apocalyptic, written in a confusing script, filled with clues, and you instantly have the promise of lots of threads that you can pull on to unweave this mystery. And that's, I think, a great example of delivering on that promise.
Yeah, I've always preferred hooks that kind of flip the expectations. That basically, it's almost like a bait and switch. You try to involve the characters in some way. They think that they're going to be experiencing this story, and then the moment that they step into it, they realize it's been flipped. And I would probably go with cinema more than anything, and with Benson and Moorhead, for example, Resolution or The Endless. In Resolution, it's a very tight, claustrophobic beginning where one character is basically trying to help another, detox. It's basically kidnapped him to this house. As soon as that you get that tension between the two, then the horror elements start to bleed into it, and they realize that they're in a completely different story, and it's almost like a meta story. And the same with The Endless. The characters receive a tape from the death cult that they used to belong to. Of course, they can't be getting a tape from that death cult because, as far as they know, everybody from that death cult is already dead, and they're the only ones that have escaped. So they go to investigate where are these tapes coming from. And then again, it gets flipped. I won't ruin it, but
It's a good film.
I just like you give them something, present something, and then you've got the hooks in, and then you flip it.
Yeah, there's another fairly new scenario in Call of Cthulhu's Mansions of Madness Volume 1, written by Chris Lackey, called The Code. And this might include a little bit of spoilers, but I think it'll be okay. The player characters they don't know each other. They're all called to this house, and that is a very kind of a classic, dinner party kind of setting. And so the players are going to most likely have expectations of one type of game that they're going to play. But it quickly changes as the host is missing, and the very first scene that you really kind of guide the players to, because the butler pulls you into this room, is you discover this amazing scientific device. And now that kicks off the scenario. The host is missing. He developed this scientific device. And now, the unspoken hook is find the host and then see what this device does, right? How once you get to see this thing and that it's ready to go, it's just missing one piece. Well, it must be with the host, right? So now it's a search, and you've got to, crawl through the grounds in this 3-story house and, see what you can find, because if you can find the host and find the piece, that will conclude this mystery, and the horror begins to ramp up, So it's a very subtle hook. It's a very subtle beginning, but it's one of those things where players expected one thing. Oh, we're going to a dinner party, and then the dinner party changes. So I think that was a very excellent use of that subtle type of hook. It's one of my favorite scenarios. I love to run it.
It's good. Yeah, I've run it a couple times too. With going a bit further off the hook, maybe more in general, since you all are involved or actual writers for various scenarios, what do you say are the kind of key elements in the structure of writing a good horror scenario? Might be personal ones, or it might be something that you would say are very universal that everyone should kind of follow. Is there anything that immediately springs to mind?
It really depends on the kind of scenario you're designing. Because, I mean, an investigative scenario is definitely, the hooks are going to be different than, with a straight horror.
That's true. Yeah.
Right. There's some very broad brush things that would apply, to horror. You want to make sure that you have a good command of pacing. Horror is very similar to comedy in the sense that if you muck up the timing of the punchline, it falls completely flat. So making sure you're on top of your pacing is very important. But beyond that, it really starts getting into like what genre are we talking? Because the needs and the demands of those are so radically different, and there's just no way you're going to. I think it's a fool's errand to try to construct a scenario that's going to please everyone. That's going to, be universally joyful.
I think for me, it's slowly boiling the frog. When you want to have the slow tension for something like that. But there's I think there's like 5 sort of major pillars to horror. If you want, each horror kind of touches on maybe three of the 5 at some point. You've got like brutality, like the fast slasher, where it's just in your face. It's the shock of a jump scare or a brutal outbreak of violence, which is just very shocking to you, and it can be used in that sort of like gory way. Like humanity as well, something you need to link back to the people and make sure there's like a story there, there's a human there you can root for, and that sort of thing. That's your players. There's atmosphere, and there's the mystery as well. And maybe the last one would be like wonder. You always want wonder to be there because horror has a very supernatural element to it. If you remove something like wonder from it, it becomes a thriller or it becomes something a lot more mundane. So you need a little bit of these things, all these things sort of mixed together in certain sort of like concentrations to really like fill out your horror script, as it were. But I'd say them 5 are probably my sort of go-tos. I always go down the checklist. Do I have at least 2 or 3 of these to really ramp home the horror of the story, or it could become something else. I've got a scenario called Fever, which you could probably take out the mythos element, completely just be a survival horror, that's a survival scenario rather than a horror scenario as well. So like you need that element, that touch of wonder, to really drive it into something uncanny and something darker, I guess.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that are important in a good horror scenario are the things that are really important in any scenario. For me, one of the things that I look for when I've written a scenario is whether I'm bringing across the intentionality of presenting what the scenario is. And I guess what I mean by that is stories have certain shared qualities, like whether it's the hook, whether it's the climax, but do all of these elements feed into what the scenario is fundamentally trying to accomplish? What building off of what's being said earlier by Travis, that you can't please everyone. It's important to know what are you trying to sort of sell the audience, right? So if it's body horror, making sure that consistently all the different elements that are part of your story are in some way weaving back into that theme, whether it is in the description of the locations, whether it is in the actions that the players have available to them, whether it's in the monster, and making sure that in that way you kind of have this cohesive whole. I think that's true for any good scenario, but especially in horror, I think it's telling when you have missteps, and all the more rewarding when it all comes together.
Yeah, and especially talking about horror, I think one of the things, an element that is important in the gaming is the player should always feel like there's danger around them. In some games, you might be doing a setting, and the setting is dangerous, but that in itself is not a horror story. But the guy with the chainsaw who's just beyond the light, he's somewhere there in the darkness. That's the horror. That's the thing. Like, oh my God, he's going to be coming out. He's going to come and get us. And so having and reminding the players, if you can have an element that can constantly kind of remind the players, oh, by the way, don't sleep well. You are in danger. The danger's lurking nearby. Constantly reminding them of that will always keep them on edge. And also, if you can include isolation, because when you're able to call for help, things are less scary. One of the scariest pieces in the modern movie two-piece It, Stephen King's It, one of the scariest things that I thought was when the kids, the bullies, are beating up on the fat kid. There's a car that's driving by with two old people in it, and the kid is just visually pleading to these grown-ups in the car, and they just turn a blind eye. I mean, obviously because the monster is doing it to them, but they turn a blind eye and just go on. In that moment, you're in a town, but that kid is isolated, and just that level of isolation in that scene is one of the scariest things. Like, there's nothing he can do. He could scream his head off and no one is going to come and save him. He's got to get himself out of it. I recently rewatched, because I love it so much, but The Autopsy of Jane Doe. And in that it's a witch, right? Spoilers. It's a witch, and I was like, man, I am going to write a witch scenario, and I'm still putting it together. But one element that I'm going to have in it, and it's that element to just keep reminding the players that you are in danger, is crow. I learned, I didn't know this. Crows and ravens, like parrots, are talking birds. And I'm just going to have this one crow that hangs around, and it's always just out of reach. It's in a tree, it's in whatever, and it's just going to keep saying to the players, she lives, she lives, she lives. Like, you better do what you're going to do, because this witch is going to come and get you. So just reminding them that they're in danger and isolate them. That's always great elements.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I like to focus on ambiguity. I recently ran The Haunted House, a classic Call of Cthulhu module. It's maybe 2 pages long, very little description, very, very bare bones. But literally, the players went to the house twice and ran away without going. They barely even went to the living room, just because I used sound and other things moving around and ambiguity and shadows. And at that point, they're going, we need to know more about this house before we just dive right into it. Because if you don't, tweak that horror, it's going to be like a D&D module where they just go right for the horror, go for the monster, and it's done.
Yeah.
Well, and piggybacking off of that, and also off of the thing about the ambiguity, I think Stephen King said in writing that the scariest thing is the thing that you cannot perceive but is there. When you were talking about the film earlier, it reminded me of Let Me In, and the scariest scene in that very frightening film is when the bullies are holding the kid underwater, and you just see the bully's arm float into the pool, and you just hear what's going on outside because the kid's still underwater. Like, that's terrifying for everybody, So nailing that kind of thing, absolutely. I just wanted to throw that 2 cents in. But the other thing I wanted to touch on real quick is you also need to consider your audience and your framework. The work that's going to go into writing a setting to sell to a table that you're never going to interact with, and preparing the game master, giving them the proper tools to run that scenario, are different than the tools you're going to use if you're preparing for your home group trying to put a scenario together for your home group. You have different rapports, you have different things you can pull on in that scenario that you do not have when you're writing for public consumption. So you just have to try to keep in mind. Sometimes it's more about giving the game master the tools to put those things in place than trying to work that level of suspense and that level of craft work directly into the scenario itself, right? I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't have a well-written scenario, but you should have a scenario that the eliciting the senses of horror in the game master should be secondary to the utility of them being able to elicit those feelings of horror in the players, if that makes sense, right? So just communicating clearly, the tips and the tricks for hitting those beats. Once you have your scenario put together, making sure that you're putting in enough toggles and enough tips and enough scene material and enough, even NPC dialogue to empower the person at the table to draw from that bag of tricks. Because as we all know, when no plan survives contact with the enemy. So.
Yeah, I like to give like events which can float for that reason. Like an event which can be put anywhere. Like floating elements, like is something that can be used by the GM to bring them back on track. I do it all the time now in scenarios. Like the first one, I stole it from the Crimson Letter. They do it with a pair of gangsters. No matter where the players are, these two gangsters will show up and just kindly just make a mess of things and bring them back into the scenario if they go wandering off. And it's just that it stuck with me so much that it was such a good tool for players, for keepers to actually just corral these cats back onto the main road to be run over if you really need them to be. So it's something I always do, and I almost write all my scenarios just as events that can be slotted together in certain ways rather than like a structured narrative almost. So it's like you have events which can lead to 3 different events, and then you basically go down the sort of list like that. There could be interactions, there could be locations, there could be anything, but these are just like contained events with triggers. So they've got triggered events within their own sort of like scene almost that you can pull out if you need to expand on it in some way. But yeah, I think if we're going to go for any good horror, I think key set pieces as well, like into this event thing, like what John was saying earlier at the start with the good hook. A key sort of set piece can really be memorable if you set it up properly. But don't have it too early, because if you have the first one, if you have the best set piece in your scenario at the start, all the rest of the scenario is going to suck, because they're always going to refer back to the first one. So if you're going to put something big, spectacular in it, always have it as the finale, because it's you're going to screw yourself over just by coming up with your good ideas and blowing it loads early, basically.
I just want to bring in a question from the audience because I think it's kind of fitting here after we covered a bit of ground. What would you say makes or breaks a horror scenario?
Oof.
It's been my experience. So I've had to, burnt hand teaches best. That if you assault the players too early, too quickly, and maybe even too strongly, they will react with, well, my character clearly would not go any further. And they will retreat. They'll retreat from the scenario. They'll retreat from the story. They'll retreat from the investigation. And so it's a fine line on how hard can you hit them, and will they still continue to go deeper into that dark cave? And so it's important, to just kind of make it light, make it so that they still see value in finishing the investigation and being the heroes, versus saving their own skin. And you keep that going until they don't even realize they've gone past the tipping point, and now it's, finish it or else, because there's no going back. And so, yeah, if you are too aggressive in your scenario too early, you're just going to scare them off, and I think that's how you can ruin a good scenario.
The best way to avoid that is don't give them an out. If you're going to open big like that, make sure you don't give them an out. And to touch on the other point, if you're going to have a big set piece, make sure that either they can't leave it or they always wind up back in it. Which is where the cabin in the woods scenario. I don't know why I've got so much Evil Dead on the brain right now, but it makes a great example, right? Like once they open that book, they're done, and it starts off pretty fast, with pretty horrible stuff. I think if a lot of it's about making sure you're using the right tool for the job. Really, ask yourself at each junction, what do I want to accomplish here? What's the best tool to accomplish that to get to the next junction? Having these various things in the toolkit, touching on the humanity of the characters, touching on, memory, things like that are very good ways of dragging the players in. But again, some of that starts coming in more into like table technique as opposed to like writing it into the scenario. You can always make those tips and suggestions, but those are the kinds of things that I think are best deployed at the game master's level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd say the only thing I'd say with that is be careful. One of the things that can break the spirit of your players is if you trap them for no reason and there's no logic behind how you trap them. That can really destroy the group, and they'll just give up, and it'll become a you against them scenario. They'll try a window. No, the window doesn't work. I'll try the door doesn't work. Oh, I'll try and blow it up with these bangers. Oh, that doesn't work either. Why not? Oh, it's a big mystery. Got to solve it. It's like, oh, okay, fine, sort of thing. It's like you've got to have some tells, some silver lining to your horror to drive them forward, to go aha, and the clues that will sort of the candy clues that will lead them in the right direction. Because if you try and force that and make it too contrived, your story will really feel forced, and that's the worst thing you can do to a player, forcing them to play your game instead of playing their own game.
They still need to feel like they have agency.
Yeah, investiture and agency. That's the key, is to invest the character themselves and adjust the story accordingly. And yes, as Graeme was saying, adjust. And basically, if they're trapped and they come up with a clever idea, help them get through that. With Blood Dipped Wings, the players were trapped in an abandoned hospital, and they were supposed to make a deal with something that was living in the dark. But they were so set on getting out and rescuing a person that they shouldn't be rescuing. I allowed them to get out, and now they have to deal with that success. And that success is actually worse than what was living in the dark.
Nice.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is with a lot of the things that are scary, or that we think, oh, this is an element of horror, are also things that can be antithetical to good role-playing games. So trapping a individual, rendering them helpless, these things can be terrifying. They're not very interesting at the table, as we're hearing. And so balancing the needs of the game with the needs of the horror elements, and making sure that you're not letting the latter trump the former, so that you destroy the experience, I think is really crucial. And reviewing your scenario to see if, all right, one of the things I've got scary is that this monster is so powerful it can kill you in a single hit. Okay, great, totally valid. Potentially not fun if there's a situation in which they'll just get TPK'd, right? Total party killed. So make sure that there are other fairly clear methods by which this monster can be challenged, or certain environmental factors that they can leverage in their confrontation. Something that retains the original horror, this one approach is not going to be possible, but gives them alternatives because, once again, we are playing a game, so we cannot lose those gameplay elements in the service of creating a horror story.
Well, it's
Yeah.
true, but I think that that's also a place though where things like content warnings and player buy-in come into play, right? If I write, death in at camp, summer fun time, and I put that out there, and I say this is a scenario where you're playing campers who are at a summer camp and going to be chopped up by Maniac of the Week. There are plenty of ways to ensure that they remain within that summer camp without taking away player agency, right? It's the modern horror, the idea of the cell phone being the bane of modern horror, right? Like things become much less scary when you can always call for help. So how do you address that if you're writing a scenario that takes place right now? Part of that is establishing those rules up front, and part of that is establishing the buy-in from the players, and through the use of the safety tools and things along those lines, making sure that like, yeah, okay, I'm cool with the idea that my character can't maybe break out of this building, or I'm cool with the idea that, I might get trapped in a very small space, things along those lines to ensure. And again, it's a different beast if you're writing it versus if you're bringing it to the table. When you're writing it, you just want to make sure you're communicating all those things very clearly to the prospective audience, so they know what they're buying. They know it is what it says on the tin. And at the table, it's about having a discussion and toggling those things to make sure your players are having fun. Because it's absolutely 100% agree with what Heinrich's saying, that like you can suck the joy out of the room real fast if you aren't employing those tools.
Oh God, I've completely forgotten the name, but basically it was a Call of Cthulhu module, classic. Took place, and it was almost like Loch Ness, but basically these creatures called Elgor. He's invisible, pretty much they cannot be defeated.
Ligor, is
something
like that?
Yeah, that's it. And
Ligor, yeah.
And the GM in that case, the keeper, basically picked me for this one scene. And this scene is basically, they begin to start counting. They warn you, they start counting. If you don't respond and leave that area within 7 seconds, your character spontaneously combusts and dies. That's kind of stealing agency, but still they're giving you the chance to get away. And he picked me because he knew that as a player, I could accept that.
Okay.
Because I've been given the choice. I have my agency. I made the wrong decision. I can live with that. But to another player, that could just be, arbitrary death. So you've got to be able to figure out your players as well as the module. Just not kill them outright. Give them the chance. Frame the narrative so that they believe there's an illusion of agency in some cases.
Yeah, I think you have to telegraph these things if you're going to do them at all. You signpost the dangers, like you have the NPC die just before the main characters get in the room, sort of thing. Like you tear them apart viscerally, and then you say, well, that could be you next, or you want them to hear the click of the landmine under their foot and then tell them to figure out, or there's going to be consequence. So that's sort of like like tension pause, almost like you're building the dread. They've got to deal with it. You're putting a pause on it, and then they've got to figure it out and then act, and then you're back straight into the action sort of thing. But yeah, to outline, one of my first games I ever played was DG, Delta Green, and my GM shot me with a sniper from I couldn't see or anything like that. I just dropped dead, and I said, that's the game. And yeah, it was kind of like a weird experience as a kid. Sort of thing. So, and I always stuck with me that one thing that happened, sort of thing, because I felt it was so unfair, basically.
Well, and again, and that sounds awful. That sounds like not fun.
Yeah.
To have that happen to you. But no, another thing that brought up, just thinking about it was I ran a scenario of they came from Camp Murder Lake over at the Onyx Path Twitch channel. And one of the conceits that we did when we ran this scenario was I had everybody make 2 characters. And I was like, your first characters are the pre-credits characters. So, we start off with if you think of like the pre-credit sequence of the remake of Friday the 13th, where it's just like 13 minutes of just unadulterated brutality as each of these characters gets picked off one by one. And then we were like, all right, now we're going to take a bathroom break, and then we're going to come back and play the scenario. And so the players all knew like what's waiting, but their characters all had their own motivations to walk right into that trap.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good way to do it.
Just because it was mentioned, and I know it's often being said as the break of modern horror scenarios, that like the use of smartphones and technology makes it everything so easy. I completely disagree, because I like to have. I've been playing more or writing more and more modern day, and I'm utilizing the phone in my favor, in a sense, like, oh, they make a call, but they don't reach the police, but they reach their dead mother, who is maybe just in their imagination, and she yells at them because they're not in bed yet, or something like this. And so using the technology, I'm always saying like, yes, but. So like, if the player wants to do something, yes, you can, but there will be something. And so I've started to learn from also all of you, partially from various actual plays that I listen to. But yeah, I don't think there is something that, as a GM should negate from their players, but should build upon that and use it not against them, but with them in the gameplay. Just my 5 cents on the smartphones breaking a modern day scenario, and that's absolutely not true.
Well, one of my favorite styles of horror is J-horror, and technology is actually how the horror typically gets inserted into reality. So the smartphone, actually, you using your smartphone is inviting that horror into your life. And so I kind of, I absolutely agree that just don't just go by the standard rules. This is horror. You can bend it. If you, again, just with Blood Dipped Wings, the first thing that they picked up was the cell phone to try to get out of the scenario. And that was the worst thing that they could possibly have done.
Yeah, you could also make them a Cassandra as well. No one has to believe anything they say, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They can get so many other people murdered to the point where they feel like they're just becoming a curse to everyone else by like calling people to help them, and it's a body count just keeps racking up. Or they can. I usually seek people onto them. I usually have a pair of corrupt cops that will go after them or something like that, and really harass them and get into their lives to go back home for downtime. There's a cop sitting in their kitchen, sort of thing, going through their files, that sort of thing, because they've been phoning the police so often, or they've been trying to get on people's radars and they just can't do it. But mostly, players will become criminals when they play these games. No one will ever stay on the right side of the law. So using technology can be deathly to themselves if they keep doing it, sort of thing. So you can use mundane reasons why they use the phones, no problem. And I mean, Wikipedia is always wrong. Let them use Wikipedia doesn't mean it's right. For example, it's all just disinformation that's out there. So give them disinformation, even if they roll a good success. Just say, well, this is what's written here, and here's 3 different sources. Decide which one you want to believe.
Yeah, I think when we structure the conversation of like technology and cell phones as obstacles, we seem to miss an opportunity, right? Of instead thinking, how can that further the story? To come back to a point that Graeme was making earlier, using a phone means they can call for help. Great. That provides us more victims. It provides us a way of communicating helplessness because the police shows up and is instantly defeated or, disappeared or whatever, right? And now you go, all right, well, that was my plan. My plan was to call in the authorities and they have failed. Or use of the internet, use of Google Maps, things like that those are now player handouts that you get to incorporate. Or maybe you can actually create a website, right? As some scenarios have done. Or there's a recent scenario I played in called Noise to Static, I believe, that sort of created these creepy horror pasta movies. So these are examples where the very technology that, some of us are thinking of, oh, how do I struggle, how do I deal with this, are really the vehicles through which we are better able to tell our stories.
I'm hearing you guys talk. It's inspiring me, thinking about how to also use technology to invoke and present isolation as well. You might have your characters, pull up their cell phone to try and call for help, and yet they are receiving a streaming video that is kind of overtaking the waves, and as they look at this streaming video, they see themselves like somewhere nearby as a camera, because the bad guy is also infatuated with likes and views, and so they're streaming your hunt and death. And how often have we seen where a car accident might be happening, and instead of people running in to help, they pull out their cell phone to film the car accident, to film the carnage instead of jumping in to save lives. And so that would help. That could be a way to use and invoke isolation as well. As it doesn't matter, your demise is going to be live streamed, and no one is going to come and help you. They're just going to click that like button.
Yeah, there's a film called Hell House 4, which is just out recently. I quite like the Hell Houses, and in that one there's the girl who's with her partner, and she's staying at this house that they think is haunted, but she's still doing her day job, which is she sells houses basically. So she's with a client on Zoom, and she's talking her through the house she's selling. But when she clicks through the photos, it's the photos of the house she's in, and then the more she clicks the photos, the stills start to speed up, and it's almost like they're moving, like a very slow frame rate film, and it comes right up behind her when it does. So it enters the room. So you could do that sort of thing. That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
That is.
And sorry, I immediately got an image of one of my favorite movies, Return of the Living Dead, where the zombies are literally using the radio, send more paramedics.
For sure, yeah.
I think we touched on quite a numerous, but what would you say are your favorite tools to kind of create or fear and suspense throughout the scenario, or maybe just options that you give to a GM when structuring or writing a scenario?
I mean, a lot of my favorite tools have already been touched upon, but trying to, create and I mean, because obviously when you're writing a scenario, you're writing for an audience of one. You're just writing for the game master, and so you need to present as many tools and options and tips and tricks that you can, so that you can prepare that person to set the stage that you've imagined. And it's it's their game, and they will do what they want. But you want to try and present the tools to say, here's how you can invoke isolation, and here's how you can invoke a feeling of dread that the players are not safe, and here's a clue path, and here's how you can ramp it up, and I feel like we've touched on all the different elements that I try to use to, I'm sure, various degrees of success and failure.
I'll mention a couple of the tools that I'm really fond of. One of them is enlisting the players in the horror, right? Making them active storytellers in their own narrative. So using leading questions to have players explain to you why their characters are terrified of a thing in question, right? The old go-to on this is, oh, you look in the mirror and you see your worst fear, right? Well, I, as the storyteller, may not know what your character's worst fear is going to be, so I find it very fair to toss that question over to the player and have them help create the story by explaining the terrifying thing that their character sees. And I'm lazy, like many others, and so I like to shift the burden. And I like to put that on the player, because the players have to be invested in the game as well. It doesn't all have to be on the storyteller's shoulders. So that's one way, asking leading questions. What do you see that you fear? Or in Call of Cthulhu, when you're using the mechanics for temporary insanity, and someone either breaks into a rage, right, or someone goes comatose, or someone runs away, having the player explain why their character is undertaking that specific action. You can still roll randomly and leave it to the player to come up with a reason for why they are enraged unreasonably in this moment from the terrifying thing they see. And that, I think, gives you, as a storyteller, additional clues that you can then weave into the story later on. In one of my scenarios, there is a vision that characters have early where I challenge them to come up with something terrible that could have happened in their character's life but didn't. Right, sort of an alternate future. Their house burned down, their parents died, something like that, and that gives me something that at some point later in the game I can weave back in, because I know that is already something we have established as a baseline for what your character would find a terrible development in their life. And then very quickly, the other tool that I like is, we've talked about movies a lot. And one of the advantages movies have is they use cameras and they control where the focus is. And you can do that with your games as well. You can direct where your character's attentions are, and you can create scenes just using your favorite scenes from movies to try and recreate those shots. Describing not just someone coming around a corner, but describing how their hands, maybe wrap around the corner as they slowly reveal themselves. Things like that. We know, we have in our mind's eye this camera shot that focuses on that. And I think you can do that a lot. Another thing that I think is fun to do is say, we see the camera focused on your investigator, and there's something behind them, right, that they don't know about. And that taps us all into some of these common tropes that we are all used to seeing in movies, but when we get to recreate them at the tabletop, I think there's sort of an added joy of seeing that replicated in your game. So that's another tool I like.
Yeah, all the tools that have been mentioned sound awesome. We've covered a lot of ground with it. The one thing that I think hasn't been brought up yet, that I wanted to bring up, was mundane reality, but 5 or 10 degrees off center is extremely effective. One of the, again, going back to cinema, one of the most effective shots in cinema history is the ear in the front lawn, laying in the grass in Blue Velvet. You know what I mean? It's that tells you so much story just with that one image. And I guess the other thing to, so if you can make the mundane just slightly creepy or just slightly off, one way to do it is to have that small element within a larger picture. Another way would be, don't be afraid of like non sequiturs and just stuff that throws your player's sense of reality for a loop. You could not convince me under any stretch that every piece of dialogue in, say, Twin Peaks means something. Some of that is there to throw you. That's the point. It's there to create communication noise. And if you can create communication noise with a purpose to cause the players to go, "What? What was that?" I think you're really able to milk that for some extra sort of horror mileage, as it were.
I think the best film for that's probably Jacob's Ladder, when they the party scene when they open the fridge and things like that. It's like it really hits that home. It's a great. Yeah, I love that as well. For me, it's probably misdirection. I love misdirection in my scenarios. It's one of the things I do all the time. Scenario I played today of Sorrow and Clay. There's a character in it who's not what he says he is. He's not who he says he is, and he basically leads them into the forest, and it just goes to shit from there. And they trust him, and making people trust evil people is one of my favorite things to do, and really just make them like feel Oh, I didn't see that. I trust this guy, and it's completely been ripped away from them when the reveal happens, sort of thing. I love misdirection can also be used to lead players a little bit. People always say you can't really make players do what you want, but that's kind of a lie. Psychology exists. Design and advertising have been doing it for years, decades, almost. So if a player has a want, if you make them ask questions like the ear on the lawn, you say there's an ear on the lawn, they're going to go, "What? There's an ear on the lawn? I want to look at that ear on the lawn." That's direction. You're not forcing them to do it, but you're giving them the sort of agency to go, "Well, there is an ear there, and well, I want to have a look at that." So if you give them something like dangle that carrot, they're going to go towards it. So you can do that while suggesting something in the background's happening, and then they miss the thing in the background, which just goes past them, and then they turn around, it's there, sort of thing. It's always a good one as well.
One thing I wanted to piggyback off with the misdirection thing that you said, because it was another thing that came up from that they came from game, is if you can misdirect the character while the player knows exactly what the hell is going on,
Yeah.
that is chef's kiss.
Yeah, that's
like,
great.
well, I guess my character's just going to walk right into this horrible trap.
Yeah, it's you're trading mystery for suspense at that point. It's like these two things trade back and forward all the time. There's always the question why, and then they know why, and then they want to know what the hell is going to happen. And that suspense replaces that question with what's happening next, sort of thing. If you can nail them two elements in any story development, then you've got a winner.
One, I don't know if it's a tool or a trick, but it's basically the "Are you sure?" And when basically a player wants to do something, the GM says, "Are you sure?" And if used sparingly and effectively at the right points, you can literally drive a player to retreat because their anticipation of what might go wrong is a hell of a lot worse than anything that you could tell them or put into their head. They're going to be thinking, okay, am I making a mistake? What's going to happen? And a good example was I used that trick in an open convention, lights, people walking by, and literally I said, "Are you sure?" to one of the players, and he literally pushed back from the table and hugged himself, going, "This is just a game. This is just a game." So you can use that anticipation and play on them. Otherwise, I would say reaction, action, reaction. Playing off what Heinrich was saying, just basic help. Let the players tell their story. They suggest something, you play off of that, and it's just kind of almost a back and forth. Get away from the 3-act narrative. It should be an organic story, not just you've got your set beats throughout the story for the scenario, but how you connect those beats is up to you and the players themselves, because each story is going to be different. Each group is going to be different.
I would say split the thing into two. Never tell a story. You always have a plot. You're controlling the plot. The players control their own stories. Yeah. So where the plot can be 3 structures, their stories won't be, because they're doing whatever they want with the plot running in the background, sort of thing. It's like personal to each of them.
I just want to follow up on Jason here for a second. Are you sure? If I have players who are very confident, I then often follow that with a blind roll and say, okay, very calmly. And that usually also does the trick, which I took from Seth, who has a nice video about keeper tips as well on his YouTube channel. Highly recommendable as well. But to bring something that I think is often underrated, and I realized that when I was playtesting my Welcome to Little Creek scenario, a tool that is very strong in creating fear and suspense is kindness and friendliness. So in my scenario, the players visit this isolated little town late in the evening, just before dawn, before dusk. And I meet just this one guy on the street with a couple of others kind of just lurking in the background. And he's very grumpy. He just wants to get them out of town. But he's very accommodating. He says, hey, if you come back in the morning, right, it's going to be fine. Like in the morning, we can do all the things. I give you all the books. I got all the information you want. Just, I'm really tired. We're a small farming town, Don't do it now. Come back later. So they come back the next morning and everybody's happy. They're on the streets, they're setting up a little festival, they're putting up flowers, and everybody's cheerful and giving them food and drinks. And seriously, I think in 9 out of 10 play tests, I had the players like, okay, stop. We are not going in there. We are just going to wait for a day and we're coming back tomorrow. And they were so terrified. And then the next day they come and it's the same thing. They are friendly. They're like, okay, this is fucked up. I don't know what this is, but like, I want to know why this is. And they become angry and all they get is kindness and, hospitability. And they're just, what is this? And they're freaking out the further you put this along. And I didn't realize that, but it's a very interesting tool. And I think that's based on also like Graeme's idea of like make people trust them until you lure them into the woods to be, sacrificed to an old god or something. Who knows?
Subverting expectations is super powerful. You have to be mindful that you're not overdoing it. But otherwise, anytime that you can subvert an expectation, I think that carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, it goes back to the promise, doesn't it? You have to keep that promise to your players you made at the start. If you've got a major twist, like I've got a scenario called The Great Healer, and basically they go and investigate a missing boy who gets dragged into the water when he's on like a ghost tour of Boston Harbor by a ghostly figure, and they're going to figure out what happened to this kid and whether ghosts are real or not. And then it becomes time travel. They actually go back in time to basically the Orpheus, like a merchant ship, which is like stuck in the Atlantic. And a lot of players didn't like that because they wanted to be that ghost adventure sort of thing, and it became something else. So if you ever have that big twist, you've got to have the promise and the twist as well. You've got to really sell the promise and keep it, make sure the players want that, because that's what they're signing up for, basically. It's basically saying, yeah, this is a horror film, but it's not at the end of the day. It's like killing the promise.
And to clarify the point I was making, I was not so much talking about like a major plot twist as when you have an intersection in a minor scene where they're expecting, the kindly, having the kindly clerk actually be a kindly person. Because their expectation walking into that room is there's got to be something dirty going on here. There's got to be something bad. But, and likewise, have kind of having the most wretched NPC that they run across at the end of the day be the one that, shows up in the clinch to help them. And all they got to do is trust him.
Yep.
Things like that. Those more on a micro level. Though I agree with everything you said about the twist. And I think subverting expectations can work well with the twist too when done carefully. But that was more the point what I was making was the micro, on the micro level, not the macro.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And you can also use the uncanny, because as you were talking, I mean, the ear and David Lynch. I mean, some of the most terrifying scenes have been filmed by David Lynch. I mean, Mulholland Drive, that freaking coffee shop scene. My soul has left my body by the end of that. If you could, it's all you need is just like a little tweak, a little twist. Just add something that is not right, and then the players are just going to, add everything into it, and they're going to become more invested too.
Players often feel like anything the keeper says or does is a level of attack on them, whether it's subtle or overt. And so if everyone is being super nice, players are going to look for the cracks in that. They want to see what's wrong with that. And it is a balancing act, to try and have interactions with NPCs that could be just completely innocent because maybe the players are driving the adventure in a direction that you hadn't anticipated, and you're just trying to cover until you can catch up and go, okay, I need to move this element here and do that, doing that on the fly, right? I mean, I had a game where I was trying to stall, and so I said, oh well, there's a coffee shop there, and it's being run by the Daughters of the Revolution. I don't know why I said that. I just did. And they will not let that go. They are constantly wanting to go back and talk to the people who run the Daughters of the Revolution coffee shop. And I'm like, I don't know. It's this. I mean, it's just they would not let go. I'm just move on, guys. Just move on.
Yeah, you do need to be ready. If you put emphasis on something, players can respond to it. Another example of classic Call of Cthulhu in one of the modules, it is a throwaway line. There is a malformed deer head in the living room. Has nothing to do with the plot. 9 times out of 10, the players are going to be completely fixated on that one detail. Because why did you say the word malformed? Oh, it's got to be a monster, or it's got to be a ghost, it's got to be this. It has nothing to do with the scenario. So you've got to be ready to adjust.
Be mindful with your red herrings. One thing I wanted to bring up real quick, going back to cinema, because you'd mentioned, the players when they see everyone as being nice. One of the best horror films of the last 20 years, Get Out. First half of that movie, everybody's real nice, and it's terrifying, and it's horribly effective. So I mean, if you want to run a scenario like that where that facade starts to fade and crack, that can be another cool tool.
I think when talking about how to structure RPGs, the topic of this panel, we also need to distinguish between like a one-shot scenario and a multi-session scenario, obviously, because they have completely different build-ups. But I think what I've experienced, especially when we had a con, what is an effective... well, let me rephrase that a bit differently. It's about revelation timing, especially if in a con game, when you have, let's say, 3-4 hours to run a game. How do you time the horror, in a sense, to create the effect that you desire? When do you decide to reveal the key plot points, the monsters, the threats? How do you steer not the players without, taking away too much player agency? It's a multifaceted question, I agree, but the main point I wanted to go is revelation timing. Any tips for that when it comes to specifically short one-shot scenarios? Is it something that you build upon the player's reaction? Is it certain beats that need to be fulfilled? Or is it a separate timer? Like, do you have your own timeline against, a game timeline versus like time?
I have a strong opinion on this that is often viewed poorly in the idea in the context of discussing like crafting a story, which is that you just use the force, man. You just dial into what's going on at that table, and that's what you do. It doesn't matter what's written in that scenario. It doesn't matter what your plan was. Speaking strictly as being a game master, you respond to your players and you adjust accordingly, and that has got to be your guiding star. Everything else has got to be subservient to the mood in the room.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree.
I agree that I think that's where you end up. I certainly know for me, if we assume that I'm somewhat capable storyteller, I certainly didn't start being able to have that good sense, right? So for my first convention scenarios, when I was really unsure how a scenario that has taken anywhere from 3 to 8 or more hours is going to be run in a 4-hour time slot, like how am I going to pull that off? And for me, what worked, and this isn't going to work for everyone, by any means, but I did go overboard on timelines. I had all right, I know that by the end of the first hour, I need to have gotten through player introductions, character introductions, and the scene with the hook. I know that by the end of the second hour, I need to have revealed the following 3 clues so that they can start reaching that big reveal, right? And for me, it was helpful because I knew if I've got 10 minutes left to go before we take a break and I haven't introduced an opportunity to get these clues, I need to prioritize that. I need to get that in front. And yeah, maybe I'm going to do it inelegantly, but if that leads to a better conclusion to the story down the road, when we're 3-4 hours in, that's great. And what then happened is as I played those scenarios more often, I needed to resort to that timeline less and less. And now, when I run scenarios for the first time, I think there's a part of my mind that's still breaking it up in that way, but I'm maybe not creating a Google Docs, that has all of these different scenes broken up by that. And I think for others, that type of approach might seem inflexible and hinder them. And so it's really important to know where you are on that spectrum and what's going to be helpful. And you learn that by making mistakes, of course.
Well, and one thing I would add to that too is if you have the possibility and the privilege to do so, never run a game the first time at a convention. If you have the privilege of doing it with your friends, with people who you trust and can trust you, and who you'll get good feedback from, do that first. Yeah, don't try not to. I know people have to, for a number of reasons, but anytime you can avoid throwing yourself off of a cliff and building a plane on the way down, you should probably do so.
Yeah, kind of agree.
Free,
I think this
free
is...
Go
on,
oh, go ahead.
No, go on. It's good.
I was going to say Free League's Alien game is a lot of fun, and I think it runs very well at a convention, especially their intro scenario, Hope's Last Day. It's a survival horror, and it's a dungeon crawl, and so you know what the dungeon is, you just don't know what the state of it is now, because your characters have been away. And right at the very beginning, you kind of know what your goal is. You need to find basically the car keys to get into the shuttle and fly off the planet. So because of that, everything is movable, right? Even though the scenario says you can find the lady with the car keys at this location, as you're playing the game and you're at the con, and you can see, at the rate that they're moving and the direction that they're investigating, they're never going to get to that room. So now she's trapped here, and they'll find her and they'll get the keys, and now they need to try and get out. I mean, con scenarios, well-designed ones, I think, are mutable in that way that game masters can manage the expectations and flow of the game, because it's going to be some initial terror, a lot of investigation, searching, and then the escape, right? You want to try and get to the escape in the final third and see how that goes for them and how badly it goes for them. But it's a fun scenario. It's a good system. I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's another one which actually uses events more than it does actual structure. And that's how I like to do mine as well. So you can basically take whichever events you feel are the meat instead of the fat, and really trim them down for conventions as well. So you've basically got the beats down to 2 or 3 per sort of act, rather than all this menagerie of things that if you throw too much at the players, they tend to jump around too much and nothing gets done. So you need to really focus down on being a small scale, almost being quite personal convention scenarios, but quite sort of intimate stories rather than grand stories. I think works better for the campaign sort of thing. I think this also goes into divorcing plot from story as well, because your plot's always running. Your plot's on a timer, basically. Your plot's running in the background whether your players are moving forward or not. It's always moving without them, and it will always get to the finish at the same time every time, because it's not anything to do with the players unless the players inject themselves into that plot and it becomes their story. So all these elements are always grinding forward, and whether they get caught in the gears or not is up to them. But that's where improv and that sort of thing comes in. And I think this one kind of moves over to the GM's like pre-mit rather than the actual writers, because the keeper ultimately controls the pace.
Well, and yeah, especially you had mentioned, like a scenario where you're timing out and pacing things, and I would agree 100% that if you can make it into a series of events rather than a map, because as much as like not being able to reach the end of the map and now you got to move things around, you might also have a problem where the players just beeline the map. They just sit down, they're like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm gonna go straight to the end, I just figured it out. So
Oh.
one trick you might be able to do is, literally like print out your scenario. If it's a map with rooms, you print out your scenario, you cut all those room descriptions and paste them onto like index cards, so that way you can just reshuffle them if you need to right there at the table. Just say, we're moving that room over there and this over here, and reorganize that way to compensate.
Actually, a really good scenario that does that is Saturn's Chalice. It's like all housebound. It's all event based as well, sort of thing.
One thing, especially for like true one shots and convention games, I would suggest is starting in media res. So basically, the players and you do not have time for the sit down at the at the bar or the tavern to establish your characters. Throw them right in right away, and then have a series of questions that helps engage them and ties them to the story. A good scenario for Cult was Divided We Run. Or basically, the scenario is the group has done something together. It has gone terribly wrong, and now they're in a car trying to get away from it. So you ask the players who did what, and you actually start playing them off each other already, but you're also establishing the relationships, and then the story can progress from there. And when we ran it for a convention, and literally the car was on the side of a cliff about to go over, and by the end of that like 10-minute panic, the story was completely established and we were just running with it.
Another technique that is similar to that I find very fun, but it can be a lot for a GM to track, is if you start off in media res, you've got your first round of combat or your first round of action, and then you say, all right, so 3 hours earlier, how did we start to get here? And you do a scene of role play, and then you do the next round of that combat that you started with. So that the one combat of the game, the big combat of the game, is taking place spread out throughout the evening, and you just have to get them to a point that narratively makes sense for that start. If you can keep track of all of those moving objects, that's a really cool technique to pull off.
Yeah, that was a technique that I used for one of my games that I ran today, where you start driving down into a forest and then suddenly stuff happens, and then in the middle of absolute mayhem, okay, so how did you get there? And yeah, it starts 24 hours before, and it was very effective. And although the players knew what they were in for and where they ended up, by the time kind of the relations were established, it was a progressively fluent game, and it was very fun. I just wanted to shout out briefly to all the viewers. If you have any questions that you want to ask that we haven't already covered, please feel free to post them on the YouTube channel, and we'll get to them as soon as we can in the last couple of minutes. And while you might think about a couple of questions, I think we did cover numerous aspects, obviously, that are very important. And I want to throw in maybe a tool as well that I kind of like to utilize, which is very easy and very helpful, especially kind of also guiding the players. If in the beginning of a short scenario one shot, I often ask, okay, at least come up with a name and a relationship to a family member, a friend, and kind of a foe. And I can utilize these three individuals whenever I see like one of them starts to veer off, or, you know, these elements can be very helpful and don't require much, but more give you the ability to utilize that character to have the players interact with them, establish a more depth relationship, and maybe even bring them back on track to the actual scenario, because he was just, oh yeah, I was just walking down the street and I saw this horrible monster coming out of this house. I thought it was just Brooklyn, but no, there you go. Yeah, that's kind of something that I just wanted to throw in on this point. But what was my other question?
I was going to say, that reminds me of the way that I do safety tools when I run games is I usually will break out, like, you know, we use the X card, break down what that is. But then I get a list of yes goes and no goes from all my players. So, you know, the no goes are obviously, these are the things we're not going to have. But the yes goes then give me things I can steer into if we're ever, you know, if the story is ever spinning, right? I know that this person wants to see somebody get a compound fracture, so I can work that in. Not that that's actually been a yes go that somebody said, but you know, so that's useful.
But you live in hope.
It sounds a lot like knife theory. Have you heard of that before?
No.
Knife theory is a way of creating characters, and I read it. I can't remember where I found it before, but yeah, it's something. You've got to hand the GM a number of knives when you create a character that they can stab you with, basically.
Like
So
that.
your character has to have these backstory elements, which need to be a burden or some sort of is tied to another character or something like that, and the GM has license to basically just use them to stab you with over and over again, and it basically it stops people making the sort of Mary Sue's basically and all these things, because they've got these elements you can twist and that sort of thing. So I'd definitely look into knife theory if you're interested in that sort of thing. But making pre-gens with dark secrets and flaws are always better than generic stat blocks, basically.
Yeah, I would also suggest, like, if you run a convention game, invest time in establishing good pre-gens with a lot to work with that you know very well. Just hand them out, and most of the time the players will love them because you spend some time to develop them, and you can utilize their backstory, but giving them also obviously a set of questions or knife theory modules where the players can bring in their own kind of expertise, which you then can use. But yeah, anyone else? No. Okay. Well, I think if there are no more questions, we covered quite a lot beyond going into the actual other topics at the convention that we want to dive into. So in short, maybe can you give just your best recommendations when structuring a scenario, what new writers should look out for, that you kind of learned over painful years and you now give away for free? Is there something on that front? Let's start the other way around. John, do you have any recommendations for new writers, how to structure their
It's easy to fall into the trap of having too large of an idea. And so especially if you're a new writer, pare it down and try and write a convention scenario. Don't try and write your magnum opus. Try to write something that's going to be maybe 5,000 to 7,000 words, maybe as much as 10, but try and keep it really, really short. And if you can master working in short form, then that will give you the building blocks and experience in being able to expand that out into a larger form. But pare your ideas down.
What about Jason?
Yeah, I definitely play off of that. Pairing it's so easy for us to try to write every clue, every character, every NPC. Again, ambiguity is the heart of horror. So be able to just write the narrative beats, how you would like that story to progress, and then let the players fill it in. So just write a lot of triggers so that you can engage them. I mean, when I wrote the Atrocity exhibition, I wrote it as a one shot, and apparently, from what I've been told, no group has ever been able to finish it in like 6 to 8 sessions because it's just there's
I also
just so
took
much
8.
meat to it. So I mean, it's both a success and a bit of a failure. So,
Travis.
If you're writing a scenario for someone to run, bear in mind your audience, and with your audience in mind, sacrifice everything on the altar of clarity. Make sure that the keeper, game master, the person reading that document knows what to convey. You're not putting in these cool twists to confound them. You're telling them how to use these twists to confound the players. And if you can have the coolest idea in the world, if you can't articulate it in a way that they can apply it at the table, it's worthless. So really go through, make sure that you're clearly communicating and enabling the person using that product to use it as what it is, a toolbox for them to tell the story that they're telling.
Good point. Heinrich.
I like to borrow principles from board game design. So one of the key questions there is, where's the fun? Because if you identify the component of your game that is the fun part, that's mostly what the players should be engaging in. That's what they should be doing. Likewise, in a horror scenario, if you ask yourself, where's the maybe not fun, but enjoyable factor. Maybe it's the body horror, maybe it's the mystery, then all the components of your scenario should feed into that. And that may also help you to expand or expel some of those elements that don't cleanly fit and maybe belong in a different scenario rather than this one, right? So if you're dealing with a mystery, hopefully most of what the investigators are going to be doing is engaging with this mystery and gathering clues and making connections. And if you have something in there that doesn't serve that for a very good reason, you should be asking yourself whether it belongs.
And Graeme.
Ooh, I'd say 2. One on the table is always offer hope. If you kill all hope, your players will disconnect with your story, and it'll become doom and gloom. Even if it is the apocalyptic end of the world, and don't hide the fact there is hope. Always make sure there's like they can see it. It's not within grasp, but it's there. There's a way forward. Because if you shut the players down again, it's no fun for anyone, and they'll just go, well, what's the point? Why don't we just end it there? So always have a glimmer of hope. Never be that edgelord who wants to completely end the world and damn with the players, sort of thing. Unless you let them strive. If they can strive, then you'll have a good game. And especially if they can give up something personal to achieve that hope, something to them or to their character that they value. That really sells the story. On a more writing level, I'd say the biggest thing you can do is seek out criticism, fair, honest criticism, but never take it to heart. Always look for it and always ask for it, but understand that it's just an opinion and discard what you don't want. However, if you hear someone repeat it and someone else repeats it, then someone else repeats it, you've got a problem, fix it.
and can I add on a professional level? If you're going to be writing for a group, make sure that you're following their guidelines. Because you're not only just following their guidelines, you're following their mechanics. Their game is trying to tell a certain story. You might want to tell your story, but you still have to fit in the story to the client. So
yeah, for sure.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and that includes things like formatting, and that really will dictate kind of the language that you're using. It's really almost like writing in another language, going from spec to spec like that. So that's a very good point.
I think I can't really say anything beyond what you all just said, but to say playtest, because the more you playtest a scenario, the more you get familiar with different player behaviors, the more you realize certain scenes are actually useless and others become more important. And don't forget to just have fun and collectively tell a story that kind of fits into what your mind has woven. But you're all writing the story together at the end, so try to think in that aspect. Give the GM as many tools as possible that you can give, like options in if certain situations are not as they expected, or make close floating, like have the secretary not in the room at the very end, but suddenly she's two rooms closer. Don't make it hard for GMs. Remember that others need to understand what the story is and want to that they can convey the same story as best as they interpret this. It's not a rules book. It's a guideline to tell a fun story with friends. I think that's my sense.
If I can piggyback off of that, and the playtest comment, as well as the the taking in feedback comment, most of the stuff, unless you're writing specifically for a client, so if you're doing like community content or you're self-publishing, it is very easy for you to update your product should the need arise. Take in that feedback. If you're hearing that 5 people have run this game and this room is a problem, fix it and re-upload it. You know what I mean? Like, you have that freedom and that opportunity. And I think sometimes people might get a little intimidated because they don't realize that. They don't realize that if you go out, you put it out there and you step in it, it's not a sunk cost. It's not a done deal. You can go back and fix things.
That's true.
And you're writing to inspire groups. It's not going to be your story. I mean, it's technically your story, but they are going to be telling it their way.
Exactly.
So just give them the tools and the structure to tell what your idea.
Yeah. I think that was a fantastic conclusion to, maybe how to structure horror RPGs in a way. And I thank my guests, Graeme Patrick, Heinrich Moore, Travis Legge, Jason Fryer, and John Hook for this wonderful evening of discussions. For all of you watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us tonight, as well as any participants at the Illusion HorrorCon 2023. Our next panel will start in a good 4 hours from now, a bit more, called Shattering Stereotypes, celebrating the diversity in TTRPG games, with Jason Fryer, Rena, and my wife Crystal moderating and talking about an important aspect of TTRPGs as well. And with that, I want to thank every one of my guests and of all the viewers and listeners all over the world. Thank you, and see you maybe next year.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.